Hey guys, it's Makeshift, and today I'm going to show you how to add magnets to your plushies. This is a cute way to add a little bit more personality because you can do things like having the hands clasped together like this. It makes a cute little pose, and they can also hold objects, so anything metallic that a magnet would be attracted to. I've also done things like add removable wings, so you can add a magnet in the body and then a magnet in the base of the wing. So if you have a character like my mascot who can switch out her wings, that's a good way to do that. And I've seen people do this with eyelids as well, where they'll have a magnet behind the eye and then have a removable piece that functions as an eyelid with a magnet in it so that the plush can change expression. So there are a couple different ways to attach these magnets, and they both have their pros and cons, and I'll walk through that. So let's get started. I like to use rare earth magnets in my plushies. These are different from the normal black magnets that you'll see that kind of feel almost plastic-like. They're extremely strong, and even though they're very thin, they are very, very strong. So you see how hard it is to separate these. You have to put a lot of effort into getting these apart from each other. So typically that's something you would want in a plush because you're going to go through many layers of fabric, and minky is very thick, so you want a nice strong magnet. So if you're going to do something like add a removable wing, like I've done with this plush, you'll want to have a very strong magnet to hold it together because this piece is very thick, and so you need something nice and strong, and a rare earth magnet is very strong. These magnets will come in a variety of sizes and thicknesses, so this is a pretty large one, and this is about an 1/8 inch thick. I have even stronger ones like this. You can see how thick this magnet is, even though it's not as wide. It is very thick, so this is a very strong magnet that I have left over from cosplay purposes. So because these come in so many different shapes and sizes, you'll be able to find ones that work for you for your size plush and how big you want it to be. And the size of the magnet does impact how strong it is, so generally the larger ones will be stronger. So you could mix and match if you find that two of the large ones are too strong. Sometimes you'll find when you bring a plush together, the two magnets together in a plush, it kind of snaps and it's too hard. So you could mix and match the different types of magnets. You can match a rare earth magnet with a non-rare earth magnet. You could even use a small piece of metal, something metal in the other side of the plush. So you don't have to use two of the same types of magnets in whatever you're making. And so I just bought these on Amazon, and again, you just want to look for rare earth magnets. You might not be able to find them in a craft store like Joann's or Michael's, so I typically buy mine online. Again, my plushies are very large, so I'm good with this 1 1/4 size rare earth magnet, but if you want something smaller or a very specific size, you might have to go onto some specialty websites. And rather than try to find different strengths of magnets, you can also just double them up. So if I took 2 of these magnets and took out the little plastic separator between them and put them together and then attach that to the plush, it'll be stronger than just using a single magnet. So you don't necessarily have to find those thicker ones or the stronger ones. You could just double up on the number of magnets that you're using. I do like to keep them in the box because it's full of styrofoam to keep them separated from other objects where I store them. So I'm just going to take 2 off from here, which is what I need for this plush, because I'm going to be putting them in the hands. And you can see just how hard it is to separate these things, and they're separated by little pieces of plastic. So I'm just going to put these off to the side, and I'm going to put the rest of these in the box. And again, because these are magnets, just be sure that you're careful around what you bring them by. No electronics, no phones, no laptops, and anything else metal that you have in the area. These are very strong, and they will kind of slide and attach to anything that is magnetic. So just to give you an example of how strong these are. So if your hand was in the way, that would be pretty painful. So just be careful. So you will want to have the magnet be one of the last things that you do before you stuff your plush. And that's mainly because if you're trying to sew your plush together with a magnet in it, it can be a bit tricky because your magnet is going to want to attach itself to your machine because all the pieces around where you sew, so the needle plate, the feed dogs, those are all metal. So the magnet is going to want to attach to the machine itself. So if you can, you want to leave this to be just the last thing you do before you turn your plush right side out and stuff it. So unfortunately, because the way my arms connect to my plushies, it's just so small that I don't want to have to turn them inside out again once they've been attached to my plush. So I'm going to do this before I attach my arms to my plush, but because my plushies are so large, it's not really an issue with the magnets tending to attach themselves to my sewing machine, but if you're working with a smaller plush, then this can definitely be an issue. So there are a couple ways to attach your magnets to your plush, and the first method is to use some kind of glue. And you could use hot glue for this, but I'm not the biggest fan of hot glue. Just in the past with cosplays, when I've used hot glue, I felt like it let me down pretty much every time I needed it to hold something together. It would just end up falling apart. And I do live in Florida, and I've actually had the heat take apart hot glue before while it's on something, and it's gotten so hot. So in general, I'm not a fan of hot glue. So I like to use E6000, and this is just kind of an all-purpose glue that you can use for a lot of things. So I always try to keep this on hand for any crafting that I'm doing. So you can use glue to attach your magnet to whatever you're doing. And again, I'm putting my magnets on some hands here. But one caution I have is that the glue can actually kind of melt through your fabric, especially on minky. If you apply a lot of glue to the underside of the minky, it can start to transfer through your minky and show up on the other side and give the appearance of that minky being melted, which is not a very good look. If you're going to be hiding something most of the time by having whatever you're attaching, you're just going to have it attached for most of the time, then maybe that's not a big deal. But for something like a hand, it is important for that outside of the plush to still look nice. Now on my last plush, I did use glue to attach the magnets, but that's because I had several layers of fabric between where the glue was and the outside of the plush. So it had a layer of cutaway stabilizer, it had a layer of minky, it had a layer of quilt batting, and then another layer of minky on top of that. So there were so many layers of fabric between the glue and the outside of the plush that the glue wasn't going to come out and appear on the right side of the fabric. So in that instance, it was okay to use glue. It was faster. I was confident that the E6000 would continue to hold it in place because it's a strong glue. So in that instance, I was fine with using glue. So if you do decide to glue the magnets on, the one other thing to keep in mind is the way you place the glue on. So you have to keep in mind the sides of the magnet that are going to connect. So on one side they will come together, then on the other side they will repel each other. So you need to place the glue on the side where they attract. So on these magnets, if I wanted to figure out which side is which, you can just place the magnet on the side of the hand that you want and just in the general area, and then kind of just put the magnet on the other side, and it's just gonna hold on to itself whichever way is appropriate. If I flip it around and try to push it on, it'll just naturally oppose each other. So if you kind of just let it go, it will grab onto each other. So now you know that the glue needs to go on that side, and then obviously the glue needs to go on this side the way you originally had it. So the second method is to make a little fabric pouch for your magnet to sit in that you would sew into the seam allowance of your pattern piece. The first thing is that you want your color to kind of match or not be able to be seen through your color of minky. So this is a problem with lighter colors of minky. The lighter colors can show what is beneath the minky. So most of the time this isn't a problem because you're just stuffing your plush with polyfill, which is white. But if you had a darker colored fabric underneath a very light color of minky, then you might be able to see that through the minky. The second thing is what type of fabric that you want to use. And so the type of fabric you're going to use to make this pouch depends on the strength of your magnet and how you like that strength. So if you had a magnet that was the perfect strength that you liked when you put the two different sides of your piece together and it came together with a nice amount of strength that you like, it doesn't snap too hard, or maybe you like that, then you would want to use something very thin. I went through my stash and I found the thinnest fabric that I have, which is just this kind of meshy chiffon fabric. So if I really liked the strength of my magnet, then I would want to use the thinnest fabric possible, so it's not going to add too much more for the magnet to have to work its way through. You could also use a thin cotton fabric like muslin, or maybe some kind of quilting cotton, something that doesn't have a lot of thickness or weight to it for the magnet to easily go through. But for me, the magnets I have are a little bit too strong, and rather than having to get another type of magnet, I'm just going to add more layers for this magnet to go through. So I know that my magnets are going to have to go through 2 layers of minky because I want the middle of the hands to clasp together. So to test that, I can just use a single hand and put them together, and I see that they're very strong and they're gonna snap together in a way that I don't really want them to snap together that hard. So I want to give it more layers for it to go through. So because of that, I'm going to make my pouch out of minky. So it's going to add another thick layer to the space between the 2 magnets. So it's going to help remove some of that snapping tendency from the 2 magnets. So now I need to figure out how big I want this pouch to be, and that depends on where you want your magnet to lay on your plush. So for me, I want it to be on the hand, right in the palm area. So I'm just gonna lay my magnet in this general area. So I want it to run across the hand like this so that I can sew the pouch in the seam allowance beside that area. So that is going to be about 3 5/8 inch long. But I also need to keep in mind that I have to have seam allowance here. So I want to add about 1/4 inch seam allowance on both sides. So that's going to bring me to about 4 1/8. But I'll just go out to 4 1/4 because just to give it some extra wiggle room, you can always cut it down more than just adding fabric. You have to redo it. So then for how tall it is, again, the height of my magnet is about 1 1/4 inch tall, but I need to be able to fit it in the pouch, so I want to give it a little bit extra wiggle room, so I'll bring it out to about 1 3/8. But again, I need to add seam allowance to my pouch, so I'm gonna just make it about 2 inches tall. So now I can cut out a pouch that's that size. So I have some scrap minky here in the same color as the hand, so I'm just going to measure out my pouch, which again was 4 1/4 by 2 inches tall. So I'm just gonna line that up. It's about exactly 2 inches at the top here. So I'll just draw this line to complete there, and it's not a perfect square there, but that's all right. So now I will cut it out. So now I'm going to start by sewing 3 sides of this pouch. So I'm going to sew the 2 long ends and I'm going to sew one of the shorter ends to get started. So here's the pouch with the 3 sides sewn. I did go over one of the seams because it was a bit too wide. Like I said, I added extra fabric because you can always make it smaller, but you can't make it larger without starting all over. So this height here looks good for the magnet to fit in. So if I were to put the magnet in here, then you can see it's a nice fit. But the problem with this is that even though it's pretty stable, I'm not too comfortable with it not just shifting from side to side over time. To keep this magnet from shifting potentially within this pouch, I want to add an extra couple seams to keep it in place. So to determine where you want those seams to be, you can just take your pouch and place it where you're going to want it to lay over your plush and then move the magnet until it's in place. So because I want my magnet in the center of the palm, my magnet's going to be about here. So you can see how off center this magnet actually is compared to the length of the pouch. So I'm just going to add a seam right along here, which I can mark with a pen. And then the other one would go here. But I need to get this magnet into the pouch, so I'm just going to start with the extra seam on the left side. So I have my pouch and I have my extra seam to start to enclose the magnet in here. So now I can insert the magnet and it will be stopped by that extra seam. But the problem is that we need to close it off, and this is a magnet and your sewing machine is made out of metal in the area where you have to sew it. So the needle plate, the feed dogs, all of that is metal. So sewing this would actually be very tough because this magnet is just going to want to stick to everything around it. So instead of trying to sew this extra seam line, I'm just going to use some E6000 glue, and I'm just going to stick this in here and get all the way into just that area where I want the magnet to be closed off, and squeeze some glue in here and then just pinch it shut. So now you've made a seam out of glue so that this magnet will stay in place when this glue sets. So now we can go ahead and get this attached to our hand. So to do that, I'm just going to take my pouch and I'm going to lay it onto the area where I want it to be, just with that magnet right in that palm area. And then I'm going to pin it so that the pouch is sticking out beyond the seam allowance. So I'm going to want to sew right on this seam allowance line. And so the same thing on the other end, and obviously I have a lot of extra room here, but I'm just going to trim that down in the end. So I'm just going to flip this over and then pin here. And now I can sew within this seam allowance so that I'm attaching this pouch to the plush without affecting any of the areas that are going to be seen when you flip it right side out. So depending on how small your plush is, you might have some difficulty sewing these edges with a magnet attached into it. So you can try to machine sew it, and if you have some issues, you could do some hand sewing and just attach this with hand sewing outside of the seam allowance. And you could also try gluing it towards the edges, but I try to be pretty sparse on the amount of glue in my plushies. So I'd recommend starting with machine sewing if you're finding it's too hard because the magnet keeps getting attached to your machine. Then try going to hand sewing, and if that still isn't working, then you can try gluing it to the edges of your seam allowance. But I'm going to go ahead and try to machine sew this on. So here is my hand ready to be sewn, so I'm just going to sew outside of the seam allowance. I want to attach the pouch to the hand beyond where it's been sewn, so anything beyond the seam allowance won't be seen when you flip it right side out. So I'm just gonna put my foot down, and this pin is aligned right where I want to sew, so I'm gonna pull it out and just sew a straight line with a back stitch and a forward stitch. And so my magnet was far enough away to where it wasn't causing any issues with the metal areas. And if I turn it over, then I can see that I have a seam in my seam allowance area. And if I give a pull on the pouch, you can see that it is attached to the seam allowance. So now I just have to do this on the other side. So I'm going to flip it over, and now I'm going to sew along this seam allowance. Alright, so now you can see this seam here where it's attached to the seam allowance out on this edge, and again, if you just give a little tug, you can see that it is totally attached. So now we can go ahead and finish this up. So now I can finish this up by trimming the extra fabric beyond the seam allowance where the pouch is just too large. So I'm just going to cut around the edges. Just to trim down on the bulk. There should be no risk of the magnet falling out because you sewed so much farther in here on the fabric. So now we can just turn this right side out. So now we can feel that the magnet is right in the spot where we want it to be. If I kind of pop it out here, you can see it. So now you can go ahead and work on your other part that has the magnet in it. In this case, I have another hand that needs a magnet. So you would do the same process. You just want to make sure that the magnets are facing the right way when you sew the pouch onto the plush. So to do that, you would just want to make the second pouch first, which I have right here. And then just take your finished hand and check the side. And so that is the side that is going to go together. So I know that this side here is the side that I want facing down on the second hand. So now I can just repeat this process by sewing this pouch on the outside of the seam allowance of this hand. And then I can go ahead and finish up my plush as normal, stuffing it as I always would. You can just feel the magnet on the inside of the plush as you're stuffing it, just to make sure that nothing has shifted around. You can use that stuffing to further help it stay in place. So this plush is still a work in progress, but I went ahead and stuffed it because I have some other patterning I wanted to do anyway, and I'd like to just check to make sure that the magnets are working just fine, that the strength is an appropriate amount that I want. So when I put the hands together, you can see that they have a nice strength to them. They stay nice and secure when they're together, and the snap isn't too strong, so they'll come together nicely, but they don't certainly snap as hard as just plain magnets right next to each other, thanks to that extra layer of minky between the hand and the magnet itself. And it can also hold some objects too, if you want to. It's kind of menacing with a pair of scissors, but so I'm happy with how these came out, and hopefully you guys can use some of this advice to put some magnets in your own plushies. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.